June 18, 1815, a day that would decide the fate of Europe for 100 years. Over the muddy fields of Belgium, dark storm clouds gathered, a grim mirror to the armies forming below. 180,000 men, French, British, Dutch, German, stood on the brink of a battle that would echo through history. On one side, a military genius, an emperor who had bent a continent to his will, Napoleon Bonaparte. On the other, a stoic and unyielding commander, the Duke of Wellington, who had never been defeated by the French. The stage was set for the final act of a 20-year war. Destiny awaited. This final confrontation was never supposed to happen. Just a year earlier, Napoleon had been defeated, his vast empire dismantled. He was exiled to the tiny island of Elba, a caged lion meant to watch history move on without him. But Napoleon was not a man to accept his fate. In February 1815, he escaped. Landing in France with a handful of followers, he began a march to Paris that became a legend. The soldiers sent to stop him threw down their arms and joined his cause. The king fled, and in just 20 days, Napoleon was emperor once more, without a single shot fired. Europe was stunned. The great powers gathered in Vienna to redraw the map, declared him an outlaw. The Seventh Coalition was formed, a grand alliance sworn to stop him for good. Armies from Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia began to mobilize. The world was once again at war. Napoleon knew he had to strike first, before his enemies could unite their overwhelming forces. His target was the coalition's vanguard in Belgium, Wellington's Anglo-Allied army, and Gebhard von Blücher's Prussian army. The battlefield was chosen near a small village called Waterloo. Wellington positioned his army along the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, a strong defensive line that would protect his men from French artillery. He garrisoned 3 key farmhouses to anchor his position, Hougoumont on his right flank, La Haye-Saint in the center, and Papelotte on his left. These fortified farms would become crucial choke points. But nature had intervened. A torrential storm the night before had turned the entire landscape into a sea of mud. The ground was so soft it would hinder movement and swallow cannonballs, robbing Napoleon's artillery of its deadly bouncing effect. The clock was against him. He needed to defeat Wellington before the Prussians, defeated but not destroyed days earlier, could arrive to join the fight. The battle was delayed for hours, waiting for the ground to dry. It was a delay Napoleon could not afford. Finally, around 11:30 in the morning, the battle began. Napoleon opened with a massive bombardment from his grand battery of 80 cannons, hoping to shatter Wellington's center. But the soggy ground absorbed the impact of the cannonballs, turning deadly projectiles into harmless thuds of mud. Wellington had also ordered his men to lie down behind the reverse slope of the ridge, shielding them from the worst of the fire. As the artillery barrage proved ineffective, Napoleon launched his first major infantry assault. A diversionary attack was sent against the fortified farmhouse of Hougoumont, intended to draw on Wellington's reserves. But what started as a diversion soon escalated into a bloody battle of its own. Simultaneously, Marshal Darlan's massive corps of 16,000 men advanced on Wellington's left center. They marched in dense columns, a terrifying sight, pushing back the Dutch-Belgian troops. Just as the French were about to break the line, Wellington unleashed his heavy cavalry. The British Household and Union brigades smashed into the French infantry, sending them reeling back in chaos. The counterattack was devastating, but the British cavalry, drunk on success, charged afar. They were cut down by French lancers, a costly victory that crippled Wellington's cavalry for the rest of the day. While the main battle raged, the fight for Hougoumont became a relentless inferno. The small chateau and its walled garden were defended by a handful of elite British, Nassau, and Hanoverian troops. French divisions threw themselves against the walls again and again. They broke through the main gate at one point, in a desperate struggle that was only won when a few guardsmen managed to force it shut again. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand in the courtyards and orchards. The chapel caught fire, burning the wounded inside. Hougoumont became the furnace of Waterloo, a vortex of death that sucked in thousands of French soldiers, pinning down an entire army corps for the whole day. It held, but at a terrible price. The unwavering defense of this small outpost was one of the cornerstones of Wellington's victory, tying up French forces that were desperately needed elsewhere. With his infantry assault stalled, Napoleon's most audacious commander, Marshal Ney, made a fateful decision. Mistaking the movement of British wounded for a general retreat, Ney launched one of history's greatest cavalry charges. Without infantry or artillery support, thousands of French heavy cavalry cuirassiers in shining armor thundered across the muddy valley, toward the Allied ridge. But Wellington was ready. His infantry formed squares, tight formations of men with bayonets pointing outwards, creating human fortresses that cavalry could not break. For 2 hours, the French cavalry surged around these squares like a metal tide breaking against rocks. They charged, retreated, and charged again, their horses struggling in the mud, their sabers unable to penetrate the hedge of British steel. The battlefield was a chaotic canvas of smoke, flashing steel, and thunderous hoofs. Ney led charge after charge, his uniform riddled with bullets, his fifth horse shot from under him. It was a magnificent, but ultimately futile, display of courage. The cavalry was exhausted, shattered against the unbreakable squares, and Wellington's line, though battered, held firm. Just as the battle reached its climax, the fate of the day was sealed. On the eastern horizon, new troops appeared. It was not Grouchy, the French Marshal Napoleon was desperately waiting for. It was Blücher and the Prussian army. They had marched all day through mud and rain, driven by their old commander's cry, "I have promised Wellington, you cannot want me to break my word." The Prussians didn't join Wellington's line. Instead, they attacked Napoleon's right flank, striking at the village of Plancenoit. The battle for Plancenoit became a desperate, chaotic fight within a fight. Napoleon was now fighting a war on two fronts. He was forced to divert his last reserves, the young guard, to hold back the relentless Prussian advance. The village changed hands multiple times in a whirlwind of street fighting, buying Napoleon a little more time, but the Iron Ring was closing around his army. With his flank crumbling and his army on the brink of collapse, Napoleon played his final card. He committed his last reserve, the legendary Imperial Guard. The old guard, veterans of a dozen campaigns, undefeated in battle, were his ultimate weapon. They marched forward through the smoke and cannon fire, drums beating, a tide of bluecoats and bearskin hats to strike the final blow against Wellington's weakened center. It was the moment of decision. The Allied lines wavered. For a moment, it seemed the Guard might succeed. But Wellington was there, rallying his men. He unleashed his guards, who had been lying hidden behind the ridge. They rose up and delivered a devastating series of volleys at point-blank range. The unthinkable happened. The Imperial Guard faltered. They stopped. Then, for the first time in their history, they broke and began to retreat. The cry went up through the French ranks, a sound of disbelief and despair. La Garde recule. The Guard is retreating. It was the signal for a total collapse. The retreat of the old Guard shattered the morale of the entire French army. Wellington, seeing his chance, stood in his stirrups and waved his hat, the signal for a general advance. His entire line surged forward, and the French army dissolved into a panicked mob. The Prussians, having finally captured Planchenoit, swept in from the flank, turning the retreat into a rout. The battle was over. What remained was a slaughter. The sun set on a scene of unimaginable carnage. 45,000 men lay dead or wounded on a field of just 3 square miles. Napoleon, his dream of empire destroyed forever, was swept away in the tide of his fleeing army, riding into the darkness and a second, final exile. Waterloo was the end of Napoleon Bonaparte, the end of a 20-year war that had consumed Europe. But it was also the beginning of a new era, a century of relative peace, shaped by the victors. The echoes of that day in the mud and rain still define the world we live in. It was more than a battle. It was the bloody birth of modern Europe. Thank you for watching. If you found this journey into the past compelling, please consider liking and subscribing for more stories from history.